Thank you, Skip, and let me second the welcome here. And I'm particularly delighted to be here and doing this introduction, having done a series of committee meetings all day. I have something to kind of lift my mind out of the deadening experience that has gone on from about 9 until now. So it's a special pleasure to introduce Randall Kenan, who was born in New York and spent his childhood, and I know I'm going to get this wrong, in Chinquapin, North Carolina. There you go, CQ. He graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he received a BA in English. From 1985 to 1989, he worked in the editorial staff of Alfred A. Knopf Publishers. In 1989, he began teaching writing at Sarah Lawrence College and Columbia University, and was in fact the first William Blackthorne visiting professor of creative writing at Duke University. In the fall of 1994, and the Edward Moreau Sir visiting professor of creative writing at his alma mater in 1995. And he was also the John and Renee Grisham Writer-in-Residence at the University of Mississippi, Oxford, and now teaches at the University of Memphis. His first novel, A Visitation of Spirits, was published by the Grove Press, and a collection of short stories, Let the Dead Bury Their Dead by Harcourt Brace in 1992, was nominated for the LA Times Book Award for fiction, and was also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and was among the New York Times notable books of 1992. He is also the author of a young adult biography of James Baldwin in 1993, and wrote the text for Norman Moscoff's book of photographs, A Time Not Here, the Mississippi Delta. I think we're talking about walking on water today. Is that right, or am I misspeaking? Oh, well, I'll go ahead and talk about walking on water, Black American lives at the turn of the 21st century. Randall spent 8 years traversing the U.S. and gathered more than 200 vivid and various interviews, which disclosed a wide range of experiences in Black American life today. Mr. Kenan brings to his interviews, travels, and comments the kind of deep heart, keen curiosity, and inquisitive imagination, I think, which make him one of America's very finest fiction writers and analysts. So, for example, he's spoken to an Air Force major whose father was lynched, an octogenarian farm woman, a church janitor, an ex-LA gang member, a 12-year-old girl in a clearly racist classroom, a Republican congressman from Alaska, gay AIDS activists, a Baptist minister in Mormon, Utah, teachers, filmmakers, dancers, on and on and on. So in Walking on Water, Randall Kenan takes us inside the vast African-American community to discuss such issues as what it means to be black, whether or not there is a black community, how to integrate it, ultimately what it means to be a human being. He gives us a fuller picture than we have yet had of the astonishing richness, the hopes, and the difficulties of Black America. Indeed, the New York Times wrote in March of 1999, quote, Randall Kenan, a talented young novelist and short story writer, and a sociologist, enjoys reading this kind of thing, let me presage that, set off across the United States determined to discover what it means to be black. In talking to individuals seemingly so unrepresentative of the group he wants to understand, Kenan violates every rule of the sociologist, and that may be just the reason his book succeeds so well as a work of insight and compassion. So without further ado, it's a terrific pleasure to introduce Randall Kenan. Let's give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I declare, earlier in the week, I swore that I'd never be here. I mean, I can't conceive of 27. It doesn't look like 27 and a half inches out there. It's a great honor to be here and in such tremendous company. I was originally going to read from a new short story I finished for a volume called The Heretic's Bible. It's an anthology of short stories with a new take on religion, and mine was called The Acts of Velma Jean Swearington Hoyt and the New City of God, about a woman who in her late 60s starts performing miracles. She belongs to one of these new churches, which is I'm fascinated with. I used to live in Memphis, where there was a church that had a congregation of 20,000. And it's just an incredible phenomenon. And this woman starts performing miracles, and I just wanted to see how this would, a heretic's take on how we would respond to that sort of thing. But I got here and looked at my copy and it was an earlier partial draft. I picked up the wrong copy. So you can see that the Heretic's Bible out this fall, I think, from New Press. But so I'm going to read from a novel I've been working on. It's supposed to be finished 3 years ago. Each year it's like... And I realized what had happened was I'd been working on nonfiction for so long that I was interviewing the characters. I was treating them like real people. And not to compare myself, but I had been reading in Nabokov's Strong Opinions. Someone asked him once, well, Mr. Nabokov, some writers say that the writers take on a life of their own. And he says, my characters are galley slaves. And so I realized I needed to look at some of my characters that you need to sit down and shut up. So I'm going to read you from that. It's called The Fire and the Baptism. It takes place over 20 years. There are two young boys, one black from a family that owns a very prosperous funeral home, one white from a old North Carolina family, the kind, very aristocratic with their names all over all sorts of buildings. And they are kidnapped in 1970 by this group of political activists who call themselves the Army of the Perambulating Prestidigitators. A group of misfits. Only thing they have in common is mathematics. And it starts out as a political act, but it gets darker as it goes along because their ringleader has other motives. And it ends very badly, not for the boys, they get away. But 20 years later, the two boys, the black fellow is working for a very well-heeled white shoe law firm in New York, and the young white fellow he's a gym rat and a theologian, or theology student. And one of the characters from 20 years ago comes back into their lives in a very disturbing Mephistophelian way. But I'm going to start at the beginning. This chapter is called Only the Dead Know Chapel Hill. Are you experienced? The body lies like a half-eaten pork chop or the butcher's work partially done. It has achieved a degree of repose impossible for a living person. The posture is complete, but it knows no peace. The atmosphere is not clinical as we would expect, but rather like that of a garage used for storage. None of the tools look familiar, though their grim purpose is apparent. Saw, knife, storage, pincer, rod. A leg is missing here, a head there. In some, their innards are outward. We see their hearts, their lungs. In one, the intestine. In another, the legs have been completely removed. These bodies belong mostly to black men. But what truly disturbs the eye, what causes the greatest unease in the viewer, is the living, not the dead. About the faces of these young white men, clad in their lab coats, arranged about the bodies in poses akin to those from wedding portraits, is a look of triumph, even a certain childlike glee. These several photographs are medical students at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, latter-day Southern Galens, delving into the inner mysteries of the human body, seekers after knowledge. The horror of their ghoulish display is clearly lost upon them. They are blithe in their bloody research. These photographs were taken in the gay 1890s, 1892 to be exact, and charisma was a new thing in photography. Suddenly the objects were self-conscious. Where once people stared the camera down as if a demon lurked in the brownie box, in fear of their souls being snatched away, a piece of them stolen, they were now powerfully aware of being made into a portrait, a snapshot, for time everlasting. But one cannot help but focus on the body and think, who was that? Why is he there? Being carved and dissected and studied instead of put under the ground with solemnity and ceremony. Do these young men, boys really, innocent despite the beer and skirt chasing, writing letters home begging for more money, dreaming at night of future wives, future children, future bank accounts, future homes, do they consider their specimens? Or has the holy pursuit of science already trumped the ancient codes? To be sure, these pre-Hippocratic practitioners were intent upon their craft in order to mend little Sissy in Deep Gap or old Miss Fitz-Edmunds back in Bawdy Creek. Their work is serious, necessary, laudable, And who among us would like a physician who has never held a heart in his hand, who has not actually seen where the spleen slumbers, where the liver cavorts, who knows not how the brain curves in the palm of the hand, nor been eyewitness to the mysteries of the kidney? Rumor has it that black people disappear mysteriously in Chapel Hill. Some believe they are kidnapped to the Memorial Hospital for experiments, fresh corpses. Over the years, scores of families in West Chapel Hill and Carrboro have had their men up and disappear on them. To this day, these families swear their loved ones were snatched up by doctors from the university, where their bodies were used for Victor von Frankenstein-like intrusions. But of course, there is no proof. Men sometimes just up and leave, without reason, without words. Where shall we begin this tale? In the old farmhouse, 2.5 weeks after the abductions, in the time of frayed nerves and anxious sweat, the boys sealed away in their room, slumbering from sheer boredom and heat, the Indian strumming on his 12-string guitar an old polyrhythmic Django Reinhardt tune taught to him by a horny traveling salesman way back on a snowy North Dakota night, the idiot intent upon an arcane counting exercise that only he understands, involving a vast collection of dead leaves, rocks, and spoons. The ex-Black Panther lost in her copy of Hume's Memories, Dreams, Reflection. The ringleader, the latter-day wizard, the existential lover, the mastermind of this motley crew of kidnapping flower children off somewhere in the night. His comings and goings, now more frequent, now more lengthy, leading to discussion and to argument. Trust me, he tells them. There are lots of arrangements. Don't worry. Don't worry? Asked the Indian. How the hell are we supposed to don't worry, man? You got us in this mess, you just disappear, vanish, and tell us everything is under control. Everything is copacetic, dig? The ex-Black Panther says little, only eyeing this man intently. This man she once thought of as a brother. This man who has led her into the deepest shit of her life. This man who she is no longer certain she ever understood, even back in Frisco, when they dreamt out loud of incendiary insurrection and outlandish acts of terrorism, civil disobedience, and Marxist revolt. But, arms akimbo, icy stare fixed, clearly broadcasting to him the sense that she is near her tethers in, soon to go freaky on his narrow monkey behind. She merely says, The idiot rocks as the tension mounts. He dislikes it when they fight. They rarely fought before. He longs for the days before they came to this hot place, before they became so serious, before they took the boys. This is the house that Elihu built. Where? Holly Ridge, North Carolina. When? Late summer 1970. Why? Because outside of the mountains to the west, in the east of the state, Holly Ridge is the very definition of nowhere. There on the edge of the Holly Shelter Swamp, the mouth of the Cape Fear River, home of ospreys and brown pelicans, snowy egrets and white ibis, of oyster catchers and blue herons, the densest of old growth on the very verge of the Atlantic, former home of pirates and blockade runners and lost Spanish gold. Well beneath the churning surface, just inside the continental shelf, rest the ghost-haunted wrecks, dead men's tales to tell. Not far away, once upon a time, slaves hauled water from the sea in buckets to Slope Plantation up to the salt works there. In those warring days, a bushel of salt was worth a bushel of corn. In 1970, this was a place to buy cheap pompano, spot, flounder, and mullet, the best crab off south of Maryland, and the cheapest, choicest shrimp in the developed world. A harbor for monstrous snakes and exotic frogs and Venus flytraps, a land of overhaul-wearing, rusted-out pickup truck driving, tobacco-chewing Dixiecrat fishermen, en route from the boats in the inlet to the wholesale markets of Sneed's Ferry and back. Tourism was barely a glint in the state treasurer's eye. So if you steal $3.3 million worth of boys, where's the best place to hide them? Nowhere. First you canvass the area, you go down the roads, dirt roads and trails, and around and amid through the acres of longleaf pine. You look for an abandoned house, remote enough to be unseen from any other house, and with at least 2 exits. 3 would be preferable. Once you find it, you spend time in Jacksonville or Burgaw, depending if it's in Onslow County or Pender County. This time it's Pender. And you find out who owns the old wreck. You hang out at the barber shop in Maple Hill to learn whether or not the son of the widow of the farmer who lives in Detroit is liable to come down to claim his property. And you learn he's been in a car wreck and is in a rolling chair and has no interest in the old land, and that the county will probably take it for back taxes in a year now. That's why it sits on the rim of the swamp, dilapidating. And besides, who wants to live out so way out yonder anyway? Nothing out there but bears and alligator. You smile knowing you've chosen properly. White A-frame house, 3 bedrooms and converted attic, no electricity or running water, but an old well full of the stuff, thick with the taste of iron, perfection. The porcelain flew against the wall so hard it split into 505 pieces. It was as if the kid had the pitching arm of a major leaguer. Against the wall, the canned peas and carrots, the white bread and tuna salad and mayonnaise gave fast way to gravity, making a Jackson Pollock-like mess on the canvas of the wall. Jean-Luc Depriest had segued into the second movement of his yelling symphony. Go to hell! I want to go home! Let me go! They're going to kill you, lock you up, wait till my daddy... To his credit, Jesus, who was going by the name Beelzebub, did not flinch. A lit cigarette perched at a precipitous angle, dangling from his lip, and he merely squinted as the smoke stung his eyes. The white boy, Owen Cross, just looked on, his face still wet with tears, holding his plate of food quizzically, not knowing if he should follow suit or act the way he felt at bottom, which was hungry. Jesus, who was now Beelzebub, said nothing. He just stood there, the very embodiment of stillness, his summer skin the color of burnt honey, observing the banshee of a boy, tall like a sycamore, hair down to his ass, tied into a horse's tail, held by a rubber band. He stood in his white T-shirt, soaked in sweat, and his too tight jeans. Despite there being damn little fat on him, solid as a steer, he not only towered, but filled the doorway. Not even his battered boots moved a micron as he drank in the kid's performance. You're going to die! You can't keep us here! They'll find us, and they'll lock you up and put you in the electric chair. The boy's head barely came up to Jesus' belt buckle. He continued yapping. He was like a little thrush-tailed puppy barking at a bear. But his fierceness, Jesus noted, pint-sized though it might be, was undoubtable. My daddy doesn't play. He'll beat you up and lock you up. Let me out, let me go. I want to go home, I want to go. Without a word or warning, Jesus Beelzebub made a motion backward, which caused both of the boys to start at his snake-quick sharpness. He slammed the door, clicking the 3 additional deadbolts, deafening the boys' tirade to a mouse-like muffle. They had lined the room with sheets of cork. He'll get tired and shut up, said Fatima, who was going by the name Rufus. She sat at the table playing solitaire. In the flickering candlelight, it seemed she wore a halo. Her afro was of profound proportions, meticulously cared for, and rivaling the cornucopic splendor of her heroine, Angela Davis. Her tie-dye dashiki was radioactive with psychedelic color, a circular multiplicity of blues, purples, and reds, though it was dark from perspiration. The house was hot that night, hot like a furnace, hot like a combustion engine, hot like hell. They had sealed up all but 2 entrances, nailed shut and painted black the windows. When they found the house, the wallpaper was peeling, and the dust was close to 6 years thick. The smell of decades of life entombed still lingered in the eaves and corners and the mangy rug. A leaking roof had almost stripped one living room wall of its essence and warped it like a funhouse mirror. Candles ringed the rooms, on ledges, on the floor, on tables and shelves and windowsills, giving the steamy atmosphere an ethereal glow and a living light. There were no fans, no breeze from an open window, no new air. During the day they opened the doors, but at night they closed everything tight for fear of a stray beam attracting notice to their clandestine keep. They found an old ice box, which they weekly replenished with a fat block of ice bought down in Wilmington. Calmly, with surprisingly little sweat upon his face and brow, Elihu stood in the kitchen doorway, tending this cauldron of human anxiety. With his white shirt open wide, revealing his ebon torso, his posture at once lax and strong. In the trembling shadows, he might have been mistaken for some type of were-creature. His eyes striking, stalking, serene, a Coca-Cola bottle, dripping moisture in his elegant hand. But the smile was a thing to be wary of. But Nathan's great protuberance of black hair was deflated with dampness, and his large and pale frame seemed to wilt from the heat. He was, in fact, larger than Jesus, yet his manner distracted the heart, for his innocence was a tangible thing. He could have been 21 or 31 or 41, for no one really knew his age, and his general effect was that of a child. His face possessed the sort of beauty few men achieve, only briefly in their lives, even the most handsome, for it is a spiritual ripeness. A time before he will be picked. He must be picked before he goes bad. Somehow he maintained this uncanny charm. Perhaps it was all due to his mind. He owned a gigantic mind. His mind contained constellations, galaxies that spoke one to another, each to each at the speed of light. But even now, wiping sweat from his face in worried botheration, he seemed increasingly perplexed and vexed. His great form hunched over itself as he sat on a stool, folding into itself as if the very heat were causing him to melt and shrink at once. His clothes were wet through and through. But what if he doesn't? Asked Nathan, whom they were calling Schmedley. Why exactly, no one could say. What if he won't eat? What if... Elihu, who was going by the name of Gerard, put his hand on Nathan's damp shoulder. Nathan, who was becoming visibly agitated, Nathan rocking back and forth, biting at the nail of his middle finger. "Oh, there, partner," Elihu said. "He's just a boy. He'll cool off in no time. You'll see. He's just scared is all." Scared? Jesus was chuckling as he reclined in a tattered easy chair. Scared? Yeah. When little boys are scared, they throw their plates of food at 6'5" Indians and cuss at them. Yeah, I'd say he was scared out of his wits. "That little boy's got heart," Fatima said, with a bit of rue in her voice. "You're real funny there, Beelzebub," Elihu said, "putting some real confidence into our boy Smedley here." He patted Nathan on the shoulder, looking dead at Jesus. "Give it a rest, okay?" The okay came out, not as a request, but as an order. Jesus gave a tisk, rolled his eyes, put his feet up, and reached for the newspaper, holding it perilously close to a candle by which to see. "Why don't you go fix yourself a sandwich, Smedley?" Elihu said. "It's been a long day, huh?" Elihu giggled. "I like it when you call me that." Elihu's tone was like that when you were speaking to a child. "Remember, it's like a game. You're Smedley till we're done here, okay?" "All right, Ray." "Oops." Nathan pulled a face and hit himself on the head. "Sorry, I meant Gerard." "That's right. Go on now." Nathan lumbered into the kitchen, his walk at once that of a toddler and of a hulk, his flip-flops making a nursery rhyme rhythm against the rough hardwood floors. Fatima eyed Elihu with a mama cat's eyes. "I got a bad feeling about this man. I don't think Nathan can go through with this. Smedley," and he stressed the name, "will be fine. He's smarter than all three of us combined." "Yeah," Fatima said, "but this ain't about figuring out the square root of 999. 31 and 6/10, Jesus said. Fatima raised her middle finger and gave him a disgusted look. "Smart ass." "Come on," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "That was easy." Dabbing at the water on her forehead, flinging it to the floor, she turned back to Elihu, who was Gerard. "What I'm saying is that this is too complicated for him. Sounds like somebody's getting cold feet," Elihu said, combined with one of his warlock smiles. "Oh, man, fuck you." Now, Jesus said, "looks like the heat is getting to somebody." "Fuck you too, faggot, lesbo bitch, pole polisher, muff diver." Elihu sighed. "What is this, high school? Will you two act your IQs and not your age? Don't go putting no jinx on my plan." He hitched up his pants. "I got my mojo working. The moon is right. The stars are bright, and ain't none of us getting laid tonight. Now stop your fretching and bitching and moaning. It's under control. Trust the wizard, baby. Trust him." He gave them both a smile and as radioactive as starlight. Fatima and Jesus smirked at each other in unison. She went back to her card game. He went back to his newspaper. At that moment, there came another thud from the boy's room, and a pounding commenced, like the tattoo of horses' hooves in the distance. Jesus piped up, "Your turn, Gerard, and be sure to put the fear of God into him. You hear?" Elihu paused for a moment. His countenance slackened as he peered through the thrice-locked door, and he said, "Fear of the devil works much better." "I won't hurt that boy," Fatima said. "That's not in our plan. I ain't going to hurt him, just break his will." I'm going to skip a section about the first kidnapping in America for profit, which was actually in 1874, which is an interesting story about little Charlie Ross. Do we start with the police finding two cars 9 and 10 days later, one in the middle of a field outside of the town of Micro, North Carolina, the other behind an abandoned tobacco barn not far from the town limits of Fuquay-Varina, North Carolina. One car, a beige 1968 Lincoln, exactly the exact year and model and car of the color owned by O.P. Cross. The other car, a black 1970 Fleetwood Cadillac, the same year and model and color of the car owned by Drummond DePriest. It would take the authorities less than one day to establish that the license plates on both cars were stolen from other North Carolina vehicles. It would take the authorities another day and 14 hours to trace the VIN numbers and establish that both cars were registered to a Mrs. Gerard de Narbonne of Bellingham, Washington. It would take 19 days more to convince the police that there was no record of any such woman existing, though they continued to search. On Friday, September 18th, 1970, Jean-Luc DePriest, age 11, son of Drummond and Clara DePriest, whose family owned and operated the DePriest Funeral Home and the Rest Assured Burial Society, was abducted from the Chapel Hill Friends School at 12:35 p.m. On Friday, September 18th, 1970, Owen Terrell Simmons Cross, age 10, son of Phineas Terrell Cross and Margaret Cross Caramellis, the grandson of Owen O.P. Cross, the retired chairman of the First American Mercantile National Bank and chairman and president of Kenan Securities Incorporated, and former chairman of the Cross Endowment, was abducted from the Durham Academy. It's 3:05 p.m. At the end of the day, they would learn Jimi Hendrix had died. Years later, to kidnap a child from school would be much more difficult, if not impossible, yet not impossible, but certainly more difficult. Nowadays, a strange visitor's ID would be checked and double-checked, addresses, driver's license numbers, social security numbers, the digits that speak louder than words. But in 1970, who would conceive of such a thing in Durham, in Chapel Hill, in North Carolina? You are Jean-Luc DePriest, you are 11 years old, and you are wedged between a black woman who is not who she says she is. She says she's your mother's sister Margaret from Philadelphia, though you haven't laid eyes on your aunt since you were 3 years old, and you know in your belly that this woman looks nothing like your mother or your grandmother, and a big man, a man you believe to be an Indian, though you've never seen one in real life. You have never seen anyone who looks like him, nor a man with hair that long. The woman has on a nice suit of black clothes and a broad black hat and sunglasses and gloves. The man has on sunglasses too. He tells you to be quiet, not to move. He puts his big hand on your neck when you start to yell. You instinctively stop. You've never experienced such a hand so big. Not even your father's hand is that big. You've always thought of your father as a big man. You think of your father and what he will do to this man or this woman after he lays into you for getting yourself into such trouble, for you know it must be your own fault. You know you must have done something wrong, because it's always your fault when something bad like this happens, and this feels pretty bad, pretty darn bad. And your grandmother will be mad too. Part of you thinks this was an adventure, knowing it will end. Part of you is quaking, though you're not going to let them see that part. No, no, no. Just like your grandmother says, never let anybody know what you're thinking, never. You are Owen Terrell Cross. You're 10 years old, and your hands are tied together, and you're sitting in the back of a loud little VW Bug. You know it's a VW bus because you rode in one once with your father, and you remember the funny burr, burr, rum of the engine. A black man drives, and a white man, a very large white man, sits in the passenger seat and keeps looking back at you. What is this look on his face? You're crying, and he keeps asking the black man if you're hurt, and the black man says, no, no, he'll be all right. But you wonder if he will be all right. what you are feeling, and you can feel your heart pounding you've never felt before. The feeling is like the feeling you feel when you suspect there's someone in your house, when the lights are out, when your grandfather makes you go to the dark room, and when you know the headless horseman awaits, when your dreams turn into nightmares and you're running, and you know you won't escape, except this time you're not dreaming, and the black man is driving, and the white man is looking back at you, and you've just wet your pants, and and now you're crying because you're ashamed. You're ashamed, and the wet, warm liquid has begun to slide down your legs, and all you can wonder is what these two men will do to you when they find out you've peed on their seat. Your birthday is in 15 days. So where will we begin this tale? This story of thievery, murder, kidnapping, and repentance. This unruly tale, this many-headed, many-hearted, many-footed tale, this cancerous tale, this tale of greed and lust, this tale of kidnapping, midnight longings, of midnight dealings, of frightened boys and fed-up women, of therapists and dreams, hedge funds and feng shui. How to begin the story of bull-riding boys and LSD-dropping girls back in the days when the moon had just been trod upon and the Southern Baptists still pretended to love the Lord. This tale of memory and forgetting, of having and not giving up, of wanting without a clue, of hating without memory, tale of heartbreak, tale of tragedy, tale of woe, hubris and mathematics, of lust and body fluids, of family secret and historical fact, spiderweb tale, quicksand tale, money tale, tale of cheap grace, tale of costly grace. Looking at these pictures, at these forlorn bodies, one cannot wonder about the loneliness of the dead. And in our daily body, we carry many a benign secret. Itchy testicles, itching vaginas, funky armpits, treacly breath, stinky feet, runny noses, roamy eyes. Yet there are deeper intimacies within intimacies, the secrets that keep themselves. Whom did he love and why? What did his mother say to him when he was agitated to make him feel safe? What was his best time of day? What food reminded him of love? What smell alone made him feel safe? These photographed bodies are now clothed in anonymity. These corpses carry no secrets now, yet they are the very heart of mystery. The mystery grows day by day, year by year, as the photographs grow older, dimmer, more brittle, as the memory melts into the gaping maw of time. Are you experienced? Thank you.
Thank you, Randall. That was marvelous. Good, very powerful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Before I introduce Patricia Powell, who will be introducing Helen Lee, I want to introduce someone else who's here, and that's Helen Lee's mother, Dorothy Lee. Dorothy Lee, and full disclosure, these are members of my family, or I'm members of their family. We're cousins. Helen's grandmother and my grandfather were brothers and sisters, Gateses. And I'm very proud of her. This is not why she was invited to read in this series. Though I'm not above that kind of thing. In this case, it had absolutely nothing to do with it. But Helen would not be here, literally and figuratively, particularly as a literary person, without the influence and model of Dorothy. Dorothy Lee was not only the first woman to take the PhD in comparative literature, well, I should say it the other way around, shouldn't I? Not only the first black person to take the PhD in comparative literature from Harvard, but the first woman as well. And she's now, thank goodness, removed herself from Ann Arbor to, where's that you live? Arlington, right, one of those places outside of Cambridge. And she is a non-resident fellow at the Du Bois Institute. And this is her first public event that we've sponsored, and I'd like for you to join me in welcoming my cousin and friend and person I admire, Dorothy Lee. And our family has established a prize, which will be administered by the Department of Afro-American Studies, in Dorothy's name for the best essay written that year in a class on any aspect of literature, and more particularly mythology in literature, which was Dorothy's great passion and area of expertise. And we will award the first one at commencement in June. Now, here to introduce Here to introduce Helen Lee is my colleague from the English department, Professor Patricia E. Powell, who also will be reading next month with Maurice Condé. And Patricia is the Briggs Copeland Lecturer on English and American Language and Literature. Please join me in welcoming Patricia Powell.
When Helen Elaine Lee's first novel, The Serpent's Gift, was published by Athenaeum in 1994, it was described by the LA Times as a book whose colors will linger behind the eyes long after you read the final page. This novel, lyrical in its presentation and full of bravura storytelling, recounts a haunting tale of two African-American families who are reunited by a death that moves them so profoundly they begin to live again and to love. Watermarked, her second novel, published in 1999 by Simon & Schuster, about two estranged sisters who reunite in a search to untangle the mystery of their father's past, is written in a prose so luminous, the New York Times writes, "Reading Watermarked, you are struck by the dire story, but even more by the beauty with which Lee pencils in the details of her characters' lives. Storytelling, memories, ancestral ties, community, pulling light out of darkness, making art from loss, finding truth and integrity where there is utter deprivation. This is the territory of Helen Elaine Lee's fiction, and she handles the terrain masterfully. In Watermarked, as a sister's search for truth continues, over and over again, we too are caught off guard by the disclosures. We too are moved to self-discovery. Linking the personal with the political, as great writers often do, Lee's story of the sisters' missing history is also the story of a collective Black history. We watch the sisters grapple with what it means to be without a coherent past. We see them inventing new selves from conversations, from stories, and how with each fragment a new level of self is revealed, a new truth, and with that kind of empowerment, a different way of facing the world. Helen Elaine Lee began writing immediately after she graduated from Harvard Law School, composing stories and her first novel during her 9 years as a practicing lawyer. Her stories have appeared in Callaloo, Sage, and several anthologies including Children of the Night, the best short stories by Black writers, and Ancestral Home, the Black story in the Americas and Europe. She is Associate Professor in the program in Writing and Humanistic Studies at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she's working on a new novel about the lives of inmates in American prisons, where she also runs writing workshops. Helen Elaine Lee.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be included in this series and to be introduced by my old friend Patricia, and also to read with Randall Kenan. When Skip invited me to read and told me some of the people who'd be reading, I said, could I please read with Randall Kenan? Because I had just taught Let the Dead Bury Their Dead last semester at MIT in my advanced fiction class. So many privileges. I'm going to read a story today, which grew out of my father's illness and dying, and out of witnessing my mother's role in that process. Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Okay. So that was my point of departure. This experience in our family, and the story is about the promises, the commitments we make in marriage, in partnership, the structure and the framework that they provide, the ways in which we draw on these promises, how they're strained and bend, and how they decay and survive. So what part has the survivor played? And what did it cost? What deaths does his dying bring to her? What is she left to confront? What do we draw on in loving over time? What endures? Okay, this story is called Marriage Bones. He sleeps in the bed beside hers, floating on the air mattress that keeps his skin from troubling into sores. She has tucked him in according to the rhyme and ritual he once used with their daughters, wondering as she anchored the blanket at the foot of the bed how the shrunken man before her could be the same one who loved to dance. He cries out, and she isn't sure if it is pain or the language of release sleep brings, a mourning for what this day, just closing, has claimed. She reaches out across the gulf between their beds to touch his back and moves her fingers along the slackened skin to feel the outline of each rib, thinking how bones ought to endure. At her touch, he stirs and settles further into night. She closes her book and turns off the light. Bones, she says to herself, trying to think of armature, of structure itself as open to ruin. She has never, no matter how hard she's tried, been able to picture the start of the disease that is taking him there in the marrow, and she lies awake, her fingers on his back, and tries to imagine the sinister conquest going on beneath her hand. With the sound of his breathing as background she has known for 40 years, she thinks back over the day. That morning he had turned to her as she was putting down his breakfast tray and asked, "Ina, where are we today?" And she had quietly, patiently said that they were home. Home, he had repeated, as he fought to raise himself from lying to sitting. Ina helped him up with her steady hands, feeling the strain in her own tired back, and kissed him. "Home, Pellman, you're home with me." Explaining the transition from the hospital to their house that had happened several times, she got him started on his breakfast and then helped him wash and dress and got him settled in the den. He sat and stared at the shelf of framed photographs beside his chair, arching his numb fingers together into steeples. He tried, as he did each day, to place himself within the display of captured moments that told the story of his life. Staring at the pictures on the shelf, he saw his daughters, Cam and Brenda, and reached out to touch the raised flowers along the edge of the silver frame. Brenda. He knew those toddler legs that propelled her to the ocean's edge, and the upraised arms scattering water in exclamation at the joy of breaking waves. And there was Cam, her infant features just taking shape, in one of his fedora hats. A flash of memory came to him of her tiny feet on top of his as they danced around the room. He looked at their pictures, and he recognized them, Brenda and Cam. Pellman looked on and saw his own childhood, and Ina's too, in the brownish photos that were fuzzy and cracked, noticing how their faces were painted in to make them look less brown. He remembered the stiff woolen clothes which almost made him itch to look at them, and the high shoes with small leather buttons that required a hook. As he peered at the weeping willow backdrop and his own boyhood face, the smell of that day surfaced, of the photographer's cigar smoke, of dust and closed-in heat. He looked at the picture of Ina in curls and a big stiff bow, and he saw the Ina he knew in the determined set of the girl's mouth, in the way she clutched her folding fan. There were pictures of graduations and grandchildren, and the family portrait with everyone spiffed up and smiling big. He knew that red dress of Ina's, red with little white curved moon shapes that he had given as a birthday gift. He found a tether to something in each picture, and then he realized, lacing his fingers together tighter and tighter, that he didn't know how long ago any of the moments he was looking at had passed, nor how they fit together to make where he had been. Telling himself that it would make a whole if he tried, Pellman focused on the posed portrait of his wedding day. He saw how lovely Ina was, her open face and thick dark hair crowned with flowers. And that was him in a black suit, standing next to her, next to Ina, his arm around her waist. We are gathered here. The words came back to him, but where was here? He didn't know. Here, we are gathered here, reaching out to pick up the picture. He knocked it to the floor. Hearing something fall, Ina rushed in, hands wet from soaking soiled sheets, and was relieved to find that he was safe. There was nothing to be mopped up or swept up or pieced together. But his apology and the angry fear she detected in it inspired her to bend and smooth the hair back from his clay-brown face. And glancing from Pellman to the picture as she put it on the shelf, she stopped and thought, "There's still his eyes." Often lately, Ina finds herself searching for recognizable things. Her glance strays sometimes to the figurines that have always stood on the hall table, and she stops before the gold clock they received as a wedding gift, bending to look in at the works and weighted pendulum, safe behind the curved glass front. She picks up the coffee canister and inhales its familiar smell, or turns her wedding band round and round and round. Sometimes she opens the kitchen cabinets and touches the smooth blue mixing bowl that was known by the hands of women she has loved, pausing to recall the chip that reveals the rough tan clay beneath the glaze as she reaches over the rim and down the side to feel her way to the curved bottom that is veiny with dark lines. Remembering her Nana and her mother who held the marine blue bowl in the bend of an arm while stirring, she can hear the spoon against the crockery and the rhythm of their quiet voices, talking as they worked. She looked at Pellman as she returned the wedding portrait to the shelf, and having found the known thing, she whispered to herself, his eyes are still the same. And as she set it down and straightened it, she remembered, too, their wedding day, the music and the faces and the heavy stone smell of the church, the ivory fabric of her dress with its hooks and stays, and the thick scent of lilies that left their mark of orange pollen dust. His arms around her while they danced in their first naked touch, Pellman's soft umber eyes, and the vows they made, which he said were like the skeleton of their life together, their marriage bones. Ina looked at the picture, and a rush of recollection surfaced from that day, the day that marked from this day forward, in sickness and in health. In the middle of his favorite afternoon program, he asked her, "Do we have any chocolate, Ina, any chocolate in there?" And she reminded him for the third time that day that he couldn't eat chocolate, that it made him sick. She tried to say it patiently and handed him the remote control so that he could change the TV channels as he wished. And then she sat for a bit while he flew from program to program in a blur of images and sounds, and she rested from a morning of finding misplaced things and righting what had gone awry. She would stop, she thought, for a minute, and then she would shower and dress while he was occupied with lunch. Soon she was up and back to waging her war against stains and odors, thinking how little grace there was in the decline of things. On her knees scrubbing, Ina thought that even if she did manage to erase the tale of things spilled and leaked and broken, their traces were imprinted in her head forever, along with the smell of vacant sameness that she identified with hospital food, the smell that met you when you entered the ward, the smell underneath the covered dinner tray she could remember into the present at any time. And then Pellman was calling her, and she got up and rinsed her hands and went to him, hearing in his voice a fury that had been part of their lives. The anger at reductions, the raging for a wider definition of himself. She heard him calling for help, and she was there, answering his need to have and to hold. He kicked when she brought dry clothes, and there it was, rising up, the fire she knew as his, fierce man of infantile strength, kicking with withered calves where the blood once coursed. He kicked and shook his fist and looked away to save them both from shame as she reached beneath his knees to lift him for the diaper. She talked steadily while she fixed him in the reassuring, cheerful voice she had used with their girls. And when she met the eyes that had that morning linked her to their past, he asked her in his look if she didn't know that he was proud. As she eased his foot into a pant leg and he shoved her hands away and declared silently, jaw clenched, that he didn't need her help, she left the room and waited, just outside the door, returning 10 minutes later to find him in the same spot, his trousers halfway on. But when she bent her aching back again to offer help, he kicked and shouted and shook his fists, refusing her healing, cleaning, feeding hands. He pushed away her hands, the hands for which he often reached when he woke, blank and then smiling, whispering that it was her he had been dreaming of. In sickness and in health. After he had his nap and was propped in his chair for the talk shows, Ina saw him wincing, and she asked him, her touch upon his arm, if he was hurting. He turned away and frowned as if speaking it would give it life. But she went and got his pills, thinking how he had spoken only once of insurance and house notes and what they had saved up. They had never talked of death, and now he took the pill she offered in silence as she watched his jaw flex against the pain. "Are Cam and Brenda coming?" he asked Ina. "Are they coming tonight?" She reminded him that Brenda had the kids and Cam would be there that weekend. He smiled and said, "Ina, maybe she'll bring fudge." And they laughed together then at the family joke told for years and years. Ina sat with him, and they relived the time when Cam, barely 5 years old, had discovered that Ina had never had chocolate growing up. She had cried over Ina's poverty and spent her next allowance on the biggest piece of chocolate fudge she could afford for her mother. "She's adopted it as a cause," Pellman said, "as if she's trying to help you make up for lost time. And every Christmas and birthday she sent fudge." They laughed, and Ina said to Pellman, pulling him close with old times, "Remember when Brenda fixed that dinner serving noodles that hadn't been cooked?" Yes, they both remembered. And he said, "Remember the first time we took them to the beach?" Ina turned off the TV, and they sat in the den as the afternoon settled into evening and assembled pieces of the past they shared, remembering the time his Uncle Russell had backed his car all the way over that bridge and the crazy stories he told. As they talked, Pellman thought how they had traveled a long way together, he and Ina, and how it had been hard and it had been sweet. They sat together in the last blue light of the day, and his eyes said, "Look, Ina, look where we've been from this day forward." Soon he was asking when they would eat, and she was answering again and again that it would be soon. Focused on remaining joys, he watched TV and he ate, asking all day for sweets. If she wasn't careful, he'd make his way to the pantry and she'd find him eating jam straight from the jar. After dinner, she gave him 3 helpings of ice cream, and still he held out his bowl. While Pellman watched the news, Ina got ready for bed, rubbing cold cream into her face at the bathroom sink and looking forward to propping up in bed with a book and having the chocolate she had saved for a special treat. After Pellman was asleep, she would have her quiet time. She would have her quiet time, the part of the day she claimed for herself. And then from the bathroom she heard him fall. He had gone on his own, stumbling to the kitchen without his walker in search of something sweet. She heard him fall, taking down cups and saucers as he went, and when she came to the kitchen doorway, she saw him sitting on the floor, clutching the little paper bag of chocolate she had saved as he crammed the candy into his mouth. Ina stood watching him open-mouthed, and then yelled and left him on the floor with the chocolate on his hands and his clothes and slammed the door. Sitting on the back porch, she tried to bring down her anger as her pulse pounded and her eyes filled with tears. She reminded herself out loud that he didn't know. He didn't know. He was merely seeking the small good thing that was fixed beyond reasoning in his mind. And she felt small that she'd hidden the candy in the cabinet all the way to the back and let her anger get out of control. It was such a little thing, she said, sobbing, and it was Pellman who was dying after all. When she returned from the porch, she saw in those umber eyes, before he masked it with anger, that he didn't understand, that he was scared. And then he clutched the candy bag, empty now, and shook his fist and banged it, scattering pieces of broken china across the tiled floor, taking what was promised so long ago that where their lives had brought them could not have been conceived. In sickness and in health, to have and to hold, taking what was promised, each to the other, and taking what was hers. She let him spend his rage and then helped him up and into the bedroom where she cleaned his hands and sponged him off and got him into dry pajamas, knowing that the time when they would pay for his chocolate binge was still to come. She tucked him in, and when he met her eyes that time, they said, "Look, Ina, look where we are." She lies beside his sleeping body now and tries to think of the her before the them. Closing her eyes, she struggles to picture only herself, thinking that surely she has her own story. Surely she does. What with cooking since she was 8 and helping her mother with housekeeping and catering jobs, minding and dressing and plaiting hair, and watching the grandkids in that gap between school and Brenda's coming home, she tries to see herself. She's been cleaning and feeding and listening all her life, and Pellman often said she didn't work. She looks over to his dresser at his desk set and plaque from work, thinking how proud he'd been to be the first Negro clerk at that job. The day he had retired and come home with a box of papers and things from his desk, he had looked so lost. He had put the box down on the floor and gone directly to bed, and it had sat there until she unpacked and displayed a few of the things and put the rest away. Pellman had loved his job, and he had loved to dance, she thinks, looking at him raised upon the mattress filled with air. How long, she wonders, since they had danced. He had been fluid and graceful, whether he was Lindy hopping or doing a waltz. She can't remember when they last danced. The sound of his breathing as background, Ina whispers, "When did we dance?" Unable to imagine her own tired body feeling light and free enough to move that way. She's noticed that she can't get her breath after bending and lifting him, but she knows, too, she can't give in to being as exhausted as she is. She's tired and afraid, and although she doesn't know it, she calls out, too, sometimes in the accepting night. She calls for strength and help. She calls his name. Till death. Can this be the man, she thinks, reaching over to listen with her hand to his breathing in and out, who inspired and enraged, delighted and disappointed her, whom she has had and held through all the gifts and trespasses that are carried in the streams of time and love? Till death do us part. Ina rests her fingers on the bones of Pellman's rib cage, which remind her of arching cathedral beams built to house the tender, sacred heart. Her hand travels down over the last curving rib, and she turns to face the dark. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Now you have to come up here and answer questions, both of you. Questions, comments? Randall, what happens?
What happens?
Yeah, what happens? Come on over here, you all. What happens in the story? You left us hanging, man.
Oh, well,
we have to buy the book in order to check that out?
Yeah, that's just the beginning.
Okay. Was this an actual event?
It's inspired by, a lot of kidnappings. When I went back and looked, there were a lot of kidnappings around that period, late 60s, early 70s. And around Chapel Hill, not as many in the South, but these people who are actually in the West, and they moved. So, yeah, it's fiction.
So you made that up?
Yeah, I made that up.
Oh, man.
Sorry.
That's his job. No, I know. Questions coming. Marcellus.
Yes, actually, I'd like to follow up on that question, which is actually both of you having to do with the kinds of languages that you learn from languages, the kinds of languages from that story might be used for your case person used to be a scientist.
Is that to both of them? Okay.
I think, especially in my first book, and maybe in the thing I'm working on now, I'm particularly interested in oral storytelling. So language is used somewhat differently, when it's spoken than when it's written down. And maybe I think my job is to try to see the poetry in all different kinds of language. And I found very little in the law, I must say, very little poetry. But but I think the way that my training as a lawyer has been important to my life as a writer is in its making me attentive to the nuances, the implications of each word chosen. So I think that's maybe the thing that you learn most as a lawyer is like how does using one word versus another change the meaning, change the exposure of your client, or make you able to argue something differently. So that sort of attentiveness to the power of detail and language in that way, I think is the clearest way I see the law as having functioned. And I suppose in some sense, as far as the law being important to me, that I'm moving away from the microphone. The book I'm working on now about prisoners' lives probably begins with my father's work as a criminal defense lawyer, because I think that what's provoked me to write this book and to spend a lot of time with prisoners is the understanding that people want to disappear this population. It's disturbing, for so many reasons, and so I think in this really real way, prisoners are invisible, or we want to make them invisible. So I think because of the work my dad did for his whole life and the way he was so immersed in it and passionate about it and the way it was part of the daily life of our family, these people were never invisible to me. And so I think maybe I've worked my way back to writing about something that has to do with the law, in that way. But it was probably the seeds were sown by my father more than by law school.
Randall?
I love being called a scientist. I started there, but I don't know if I've always been fascinated by different modes and playing with those modes. And Skip called me earlier a very accomplished liar. Thank you very much. And that's what it's all about. So hanging out with oral history. I'd actually been doing that before, but now, it's even more fun to play with that. With human speech in that way, and hoodwinking, and even with science. One of my favorite writers is a Polish writer named Stanislaw Lem, and he uses that scientific mode to hoodwink and have fun. And so, seeing language as just another way of, in the last book, I probably go on too long about Mary Ellen Pleasant, that great mysterious figure in San Francisco, turn of the century. And I love a quote. She said, "Some people think words reveal, but I know that words are meant to conceal." So I love looking at them as having multi dimensions.
I want to ask you too. Do you feel a compulsion to use literature because you're African Americans, because you're writing out of the African American tradition, for political ends? Because the reason I'm asking is that, and Helen, I know you, and we argue all the time about the nature and function of literature, but you didn't read a political story. It's a very moving story. Mm-hmm. Someone wrote an essay once called "In the Space Where Sex Should Be," and it's about African American literature. And before Zora Neale Hurston, nobody makes love in African American literature. People don't kiss, people don't get down. In the primitivism of the Harlem Renaissance, there's sort of bizarre sex, but it's not tender sex. It's not human sexuality. And you wrote a very tender story about aging and love and loss and living loss. Mm-hmm. It's not political at all, or not directly, overtly political. So I wonder, what's the relationship between the political and the personal in your work, in both of you?
I do see my responsibility partly as a political one, and I think art has the potential to move people, to expand people, to provoke them to think differently, to disturb their complacency, and I think all those are important roles of art. And I guess I think the most successful art accomplishes its politics in a more implicit way, than, so that it's not polemic. So the story I read is probably less political than some things I've written in the book I'm working on now, more overtly so. But I guess I like to think about Pablo Neruda's statement that art is political because it has the potential to alter the silence of the world, and so that you can alter silence in all kinds of ways. So I think I'm trying to do that on a lot of different levels. In fact, I see it as my responsibility to speak for those who maybe don't have a voice. Most directly in my the book that I'm working on. But I mean, I think I deal with I only touch on it when in talking about Pellman's job in that story, but maybe that story is part of Watermarked grew out of that story in a way, the second book. And I think I'm talking about race politics and gender politics and class politics, through the lives of my characters. Mm-hmm. I hope I'm expanding people in that way. So.
But implicitly, it's political, just establishing that a story about two people being in love and aging together and being sick and dying, and who happen to be black.
Right.
I mean, that's a political statement because so much of black literature is all about white men. Mm-hmm. White men being, in the space where sex should be is the white man. That's the point of this article.
Yeah, right.
And it's so boring because black people don't sit around and talk about white people all day. They sit around and talk about nigger stole my chocolate in the kitchen, when I've been saving it all day long, things like that.
Yeah. Well, I think
could you talk we're being webcast, so unless you two talk in there.
There are no, in neither of my novels has a white character, I don't think, or a major one in any way. And that is one of my goals, is to depict, black life, which, as you said, doesn't depend on the permissions or the, of white folks, or the, has its own sort of, rich textures and beauty and problems as well. So, yes, for the first time ever, I agree with you.
Okay, great. God, we got a witness. Can we get a witness? We got a witness. Randall.
Well, I was wondering, are you baiting me? Because that's all my characters all think about.
Is what?
Is sex, yeah. And I was just trying to think, is there bestiality in any of my? I don't think so. Other than that, there's, they're all mixed up and all over the place. And yeah, that's very, and obviously in often cases, especially when you're talking about different modes of love, it also becomes, a very, very political statement.
Homosexual.
Yeah. So yeah, it's
great.
Very much.
Yeah. Thanks. Yes. Would you mind standing up, please, so that you can be seen by the camera? And saying your name, please. Sybil.
If I would have read your story, I would have bought the book and read the story. I wouldn't have known that this couple is black, and for me it would have been wrong. Because you said you only write, your characters are always black, and then because you're thinking it, or you're surrounded by black people, it's quite normal that you don't make a point of it.
I guess in that story, I think it is important and it isn't, both. I think it's, I think every successful work of art is about the particular and the universal, or what is shared and human, across time and culture, and also what is particular about, my tradition, my culture, my family, my experience. So I think my answer is that it is both things, that it is important and it isn't, in a way it is and in a way it isn't. So.
Brandon?
Oh, well, yeah. I remember once I was in England and I was on radio. It was live, and the woman was like, "Mr. Kenan, I was just so astonished to get, on the second page, and I realized that your characters were black, and you had not said it." And I was just, how did this occur to you to do this? And I'm like, dead air, because I'm like, are you crazy? But I also play with especially coming from the South. That's an obsession. We're all obsessed, black and white, with interracial, jungle fever and all that sort of thing. But it's important. It's important at times to recognize the different spaces, and that there are times when black folk are together, and it's not, you don't really think about it or talk about it or worry about it.
You have a fantastic ear.
Well, thank you.
That was a great English accent you just did. It was. It really was.
Thank you, sir.
But do you is the Southern vernacular, black and white, is that what you strive for in terms of achieving a linguistic register in your books?
When I do that, I'm trying to expand. But yeah, I mean, those are in many ways my mother tongues, what I grew up surrounded by, and so it comes natural in a way. And I'm much more of a natural critic and editor of that vernacular.
But don't you think, Helen, it's more powerful what Sybil said? That, I mean, the first time I noticed this with a black writer was with Jamaica Kincaid. I was reading Jamaica Kincaid in the New Yorker, and it became apparent to me after I'd read it that all these people were black, or most of the people were black, depending on the story.
Yeah.
And that she most probably was black since her name was Jamaica. But she never claimed it. She just assumed it.
Yeah.
I mean, every writer writes it. Joyce writes about Irish people, but he doesn't say, well, here I'm writing about an Irishman.
Yeah.
But so many black writers, particularly in the old days, had to say, aha, black man came onto the scene, blah, blah, blah. That it's more powerful to assume it.
Yeah, but that's a privilege we've, gained, because of those who came before, too, I think. So. But I was thinking of another thing I would say to you, Sybil, is that I think that race is important to the reader as it is important to the lives of the characters, So like in that story, it doesn't happen to seem real important, but I think in both my novels, race is, people are very concerned with race. They're very, it's shaped their experience in really profound ways, in ways they aren't even necessarily, conscious of, and in ways they don't necessarily articulate, but it still shapes the way they move through the world really profoundly. So it matters to me, that it mattered to the reader in that it matters to their lives, and I'm trying to tell their lives, and say something about what it means to be this person in this moment in this place, shaped by race, class, gender, sexuality, all kinds of things, and also what it just means to be human, both,
The youngest person in the room. What's your name? Gabrielle.
Is that for me? For me? In the story that I read is that was my jumping off point or point of departure was my father's dying, and so the facts are different. My father didn't die from what my character has, but it grew out of that experience of his illness and death, and I think, as I said, watching my mother deal with that and all of us come to terms with it. So yeah, that's about the closest thing to my life I've ever lived.
Yes.
It's
Your name?
Mark.
Mark.
It's interesting. This goes back to the sort of earlier question.
Trying to go out the door.
You think about writing from a specific voice, whether it's black or gay or a woman's point of view. You think, well, how do you begin to sort of present this both as sort of education to wider audiences, but also to speak to people who are thinking about things that you're thinking about as you occupy a certain voice. So I guess my question is what position audience takes when you're writing. How much do you think about audience and who this is directed to? How sort of controlled is the language to speak in terms that people within a certain sphere will understand, so that people think that they're being responded to very well.
To whom? To Randall?
To Randall.
You can answer it too. I find that when hi Mark, how you doing? I know him. We lived in Italy together for a while. I find that when I think about audience, they're in Leia's story.
They like cigarettes.
When I find that when I think about the audience, I tense up, I paralyze myself, and that it's really a bad idea. And I sometimes will think of an individual I know very well and think of pleasing them, like he or she will really enjoy reading this. But to take it beyond that, I just it's happened a lot. I sort of start doing that, and I can't go anywhere, and I have to step back and reapproach it and forget about who might one day read it.
Helen?
I'd say the same thing, that's a kind of censoring, experience, or Virginia Woolf calls the angel in the house. You can't write if you're asking yourself, well, what's going to be the reception of this, or is it socially acceptable, especially? And at the same time, you're writing to be understood and heard. So there's also always this process going on of, have I made this live for the reader? Have I made this resonate? So the reader's there and not there at the same time.
Evan. Randall?
I hope that meant you liked it.
She did.
No, I get very, just as for me, as a writer, not even as a reader, but as a writer, I get very bored with linear stories. And I don't think linearly, which mean I might not think very well or efficiently, but that's just how it is. And so I'd like to cut things up and come at things from different angles, and that's just the way I learned and the way I think and the way I enjoy stories. I like coming at and also playing with the reader some, approaching a story from an angle both in time and space that might be expected to keep people on their toes and pay attention, and also it's a different way of getting at character. So I always think of time as a tool.
Helen?
You ended with that rush was incredible. That the last section you read. Yeah. Because that felt like you were moving really fast. Through time.
We didn't want you to stop.
I think I was writing about memory, so I think maybe there's a sense, I hope, of time being kind of layered, with memory, that you're sort of interested in how the present moment is burdened by the past, and the racial past, family past, all kind of. So people are sorting out, remaking their stories, but there's always these reference points that are about, what has happened before. So layered, I think, and shifting is what the feeling I'm after.
Yes.
My name's Matt, and I work at a high school in Boston. And just what I was wondering is, what in reading and writing is so important to youth? I was wondering what experiences in your lives led you to find yourself in this in your career to passion. Was it anything in school? Was it something outside of school? And how do you kind of encourage young people to, to find their voice? I know there are a lot of generations that
Well, I again thank the gentleman for mentioning my wayward past, trying to, as a junior scientist of America. But that's what I really wanted. I seriously thought that's what I was. When I went to Chapel Hill, that's what I was going to do. I was going to major in physics and then go on and get graduate degrees in engineering and all these things. And it took me by surprise because I'd always been writing. My thing was science fiction. I'd written really bad science fiction novels all through college. Even wrote one, in high school, even wrote one in college. And I just encountered writing in a different way, which is one of the things, thank God for college, university. I started reading in ways that I hadn't, I've been reading, like I said, I've been writing, but not on that level. And I encountered the boom writers, and that was a big, sort of moment for me because that way of looking at the world had been how I grew up. This folk, I grew up in a place that was like 1920s to the 1970s. And so I understood, all those writers. And so that encouraged me. So, it wasn't an intentional, it was a thing, it was an accident. So I don't know, coming back to your question, how you can direct someone, but, just the academy itself and, approaching literature in a very vivid and living way.
But it's a very audacious thing to write a novel in high school.
Oh, God. I didn't think of it as someone, it was just something, it was a response to reading. Mm-hmm. Therefore, I didn't approach it thinking, oh, I'm going to write, Fahrenheit 451. It's like, no, I read Fahrenheit 451, and I'm going to write something like it because I liked it. It wasn't self-conscious. Therefore, I think I was free to play on the page.
Helen?
I come from a family of storytellers. My grandfather was a big liar and the inspiration for the main character, LaRue, in my first book. And my mother, I think if anybody's responsible for me choosing a writing life, it's my mother, because she read to me on weekend afternoons poetry and stories, and we would talk about what they meant. And as I have often said, in the canon of stories that were told was a story of an ancestor who snuck along rows of cotton teaching other slaves to read. And so I got these family stories. I got published literature, all kinds of stories. And I knew that was the thing that made me feel the most alive. But I made this wrong turn toward law school, and I actually think the fact that it was so wrong, that I was so clearly miserable, is probably why I figured out writing. If I'd just been somewhat miserable, I might have stayed at it. So the wrong turn, and then I think my family laid the groundwork.
We have time for one more question, and then we'll invite you upstairs for food and drink, and you can ask them. First of all, you can buy their books, get them signed, and then you can ask them all the questions you want for the next hour. Yes.
My name is Jovan. I have actually two questions. One for Professor Reed. Writing a book now that's obviously so teamed with politics and dealing with the prison system, where, I guess, knowing how your previous books have been so lyrical, where are you finding the poetry in the system? And then the question for both of you is, in writing in nonlinear fashion, right, as a writer, how do you put together the story in a way that makes sense to the readers so that they don't get lost in the jungle?
Helen first.
Okay. I have to tell everybody Jovan was my favorite student ever at MIT. She's now working for the Du Bois Institute.
All in the family.
Yeah, right. I actually think that poetry comes out of everybody's mouths, and so when I'm teaching these classes, I hear it, and I have that to work with. And maybe there's nothing more poetic and more interesting to me than somebody in the nth degree of deprivation trying to change their lives. And so there's something about that sort of crucible experience, crucible moment, there's this potential at bottom for a kind of redemption or kind of a shift. So I think I go in there to do my classes, and I hear these guys, these men that I am teaching, and they tell their stories, and there's incredible poetry in the act, of what they're seeking to do, and also I think in the language that they use. And I don't know what, in terms of the thing I'm struggling with, that I was just talking to my mother about earlier today, is how is my voice right to tell these stories, because it is a different kind, it's not a street kind of a voice. So far how it's working out is that some of them are first person narratives, and hopefully have the ability to capture the voices of these people. And then some of it is a third person kind of narrator, is more like the voice I've used in other stuff. And I don't know if it's going to succeed or not. I don't know. So, but I do know that if these stories are human and shared, that anybody should, can write them if with sensitivity and hopefully, I don't know, what my mom said to me earlier was, well, you see them, and so you can make them seen and heard.
Did you watch Oz? Do you watch Oz?
Yeah, I don't really like that show.
Why not? I just watched it for the first time. I just watched it for the first time the other night. So why don't you like it?
I don't know. It's such an assault. It's so stagey. It's so produced for a kind of mass appeal that's really interesting. It's a salacious, sort of interest in violence. And I don't know. It doesn't seem very complex to me, and it's all about, conflict. Actually, I think a lot of being in prison is about boredom. That there's a kind of a death that doesn't get, a kind of a death of the soul that doesn't get depicted. So it seems very, Hollywood.
Randall, you like Oz?
I do, but for all the wrong reasons.
Okay, well, don't be ashamed. Tell her what. I argue with her all the time, so you tell her. I need somebody to help me. I like Oz.
No, it's grand guignol. I mean that's. I mean, if you appreciate the fact that it is meant to be very operatic and over the top, and if you get past that, I think. But otherwise, it's going to be pretty.
A lot of prisoners' rooms that I know so they don't like it. They don't see that. They don't see themselves that way. They don't think that's an accurate portrayal.
Do you like the narrator?
Harold Pernell, yes, yeah, I like that weaving, where they fragment it and juxtapose it. I mean, that's not my favorite. I mean, I love 6 Feet Under better.
I love 6 Feet Under.
Yeah, I think that's let's praise AOL Time Warner. And I would just answer your question. I'm teaching both nonfiction and fiction these days, probably more nonfiction than fiction. And I think you approach it in similar ways. I mean, in terms of what I talk to people about. And one of them is, except in nonfiction, you don't own the characters. I mean, in fiction, I feed them, they live in my house, so they do what I tell them to do more often than not. In nonfiction, you don't have that luxury. But,
you do what they tell you.
Well, yeah, sometimes that's when it really gets problematic. But you have characters, you have things happening. Most people's lives aren't beginning, middle, and end. We sort of muddle along. We don't find a form. In a nonfiction narrative, you're trying to find some form. I adore John McPhee because he hangs out with people for these long periods of time, and he finds some structure. And you wonder, God, I wish he lived with me so I could have that kind of structure in my life. But the thing about it is understanding when to start, when to give other information, that alters the story you're telling. So what happens is when you start a story, when you realize what story you want to tell, you're going to tell a different story. And so that has a lot to do on understanding how to use time, how to ultimately structure something. And there are a multitude of stories you can tell about any of us, any of our lives, depending on when you start telling that story. I mean, I remember the Woody Allen movie, since we're making these references, Crimes and Misdemeanors, the Alan Alda character, when he says, comedy is tragedy plus time. Right. So it so much depends on when you start, when you stop a story, on what kind of story you tell.
Last question: is this a good time to be a black writer in America? Is this a good time?
I think so. I mean, looking at what I remembering when I first started actually seriously thinking about it, who was out there? I mean, my God. I mean, the revolution that, and I give her props. Terry McMillan alone created. I mean, there's these sections. You go to Borders and Barnes and Nobles. There's just a wall, of writers who wouldn't have existed.
Black romance.
Yeah. And I don't speak disparagingly. Yeah, people are reading.
Yeah.
People are reading. Black writers are paying their rent in the months in February.
And black readers are. I mean, Elin Harris, Terry McMillan on the bestseller list because black people are buying it. Right. Richard Wright was on the bestseller list because white people bought it.
Yeah.
Which is true.
Yeah.
Helen, it's a good time.
Well, it's wide open, I think, in terms of what you can do. But I think it's not ever been a good time to be a black writer writing sort of off the beaten path. I think there's still that question of where does this fit, or what do we do with her? She's writing something that's not, in fashion for a variety of ways. So, I mean, it's still a business, and it's still, closed in a lot of ways. And it's better time than it has been.
Yeah. It's always relative. I mean, there's some writers who are never going to, reach wide audiences.
Right.
Let's thank Helen Lee, Randall Kenan.